My name is Maya. If you are sitting down right now, maybe with a cup of coffee in your hands, looking out the window, I want you to take a second and just breathe it in. The quiet. The ordinary, boring, beautiful safety of a morning where nobody is trying to rewrite your life behind your back. I'm sharing this with you today, not because I want you to feel sorry for me. Honestly, I don't need pity. But because I need you to understand something about the world we live in. The most dangerous betrayals in your life will never arrive with a slamming door or a screaming match in the middle of the kitchen. They don't announce themselves with horns blowing. The betrayals that can truly destroy you, the ones that strip the skin right off your back, they arrive on tiptoe. They come wrapped in the softest, warmest fabric of care, smiling at you, pulling the blanket up to your chin while they quietly wait for you to stop breathing. If you have ever had to quietly earn your place in your own circle, or if you've ever felt like the people who were supposed to love you automatically were actually tracking your utility, I want you to type, "I am here," in the comments right now. Let's just acknowledge each other before we even get into the dark parts of this room. Because for a long time, I didn't see it. I thought I was cherished, but I was actually just being measured. Let me take you straight into that room. It was a Thursday morning. I didn't know it was a Thursday then, of course. When you've been floating in the gray, heavy void of a medically induced coma for 3 weeks, days lose their names. Time isn't a line. It's a stagnant pool of oil. My body had been broken in a massive car accident 21 days prior. A patch of black ice on a secondary highway, an oncoming delivery truck, and then a sudden, violent transition into absolute nothingness. The doctors had told my remaining family that my brain activity was flatting out at a baseline, that they were just monitoring for microfluctuations, keeping me alive on a steady cocktail of pharmaceuticals and mechanical lungs. But the human mind is a stubborn, ancient thing. It doesn't always follow the digital readouts on a hospital monitor. On that specific morning, my consciousness didn't snap back like a rubber band. It seeped back into my physical shell like cold water rising through cracks in stone. First came the sounds. The rhythmic, agonizingly predictable hiss-click of the ventilator, the distant, muted squeak of rubber-soled nursing shoes on high-gloss linoleum out in the corridor. Then came the smell, that unmistakable, heavy quality of air that belongs exclusively to intensive care units. It's an air that smells of sterile rubbing alcohol, metallic synthetic sheets, and the faint, haunting scent of bodies that are being kept functioning by electricity rather than by their own human momentum. I knew exactly where I was before I even attempted to open my eyes. Passats. My conscious mind had fully oriented itself to the room, but my body refused to signal that awareness to the outside world. Some deep, primal survival instinct, an ancient mammalian reflex that arrived long before my logic could form a sentence, told me to hold completely still. It commanded me to keep my eyelids heavy, dark, and utterly motionless. I did not open my eyes. I lay there, trapped inside my own skin, listening to the quiet hum of the machines that were keeping death at bay. And then, the heavy wooden door of my private room clicked open. The footsteps that crossed the threshold weren't the hurried, efficient steps of the medical staff. I knew them. I would have known that specific cadence anywhere in the world, even if I were buried under 10 feet of dirt. It was Julian, my husband of 6 years. He walked with a smooth, calculated gait, a pace that always suggested he was exactly where he belonged, carrying himself with the easy confidence of a man who never had to ask for permission. Behind him came a second pair of shoes, heavier, stiffer, the unmistakable rigid stride of someone wearing formal, thick-soled dress shoes. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing the room back into its sterile isolation. I felt the air shift as Julian approached the left side of my bed, where the primary vitals monitor blinked its green and amber data into the shadows. For a second, there was only the sound of my mechanical breath. Then, Julian leaned down. I could feel the faint warmth of his breath against the skin of my cheek, a sensation that used to bring me an instant wave of safety. But what came out of his mouth wasn't a prayer. It wasn't a sob. It was a single word, spoken so softly, with such a chilling conversational flatness that it made the marrow in my bones turn to ice. Finally. The word hung in the sterile air like poison gas. I lay there, every nerve ending in my body screaming at me to flinch, to gasp, to open my eyes and demand to know what that meant. But that primal instinct gripped me tighter. I held my face completely passive. I kept my jaw relaxed, my fingers limp on the rough hospital sheet. I had to manage my own physiology with the desperate focus of an actor on a stage. If my heart rate spiked, the monitor above my head would change its rhythmic beep into a high-pitched alert, betraying my consciousness in a fraction of a second. I forced my mind away from the panic, focusing entirely on slowing my pulse, tricking the machine, and tricking the man standing over me. Julian straightened up. When he spoke again, his voice was turned away from me, directed at the second person in the room. This wasn't the voice he used when he was talking to me. The tender, protective, slightly worried tone he had cultivated throughout our entire marriage. This was a voice I had never heard before. It was sharp, analytical, completely devoid of any emotional color. It was the voice of a businessman closing a tedious, long-delayed transaction. The doctor says the baseline hasn't shifted in 48 hours, Julian said, his words dropping like heavy stones into the quiet of the ICU. They're running the final neurological evaluation this afternoon. But, procedurally, we are right on schedule. If she stays under for another 24 hours, the legal definition of prolonged incapacitation activates automatically under the state's revised medical proxy statutes. And the board? The second voice asked. It belonged to Hargrove, Julian's personal attorney, a man I had met exactly twice at corporate dinners, a man who had always smiled warmly while toast-making. The board is already managed, Julian replied, his footsteps moving slightly toward the window. Without her vote, my temporary operational authority becomes absolute the moment the proxy is certified. There won't be a counterweight left, but I need to be certain about the secondary assets. I don't want lingering estate entanglements when we execute the restructuring. I lay completely still beneath the thin cotton blanket, the words washing over me, dismantling the reality of the last 6 years piece by piece. They weren't praying for my eyes to open. They were counting down the hours until my silence became legally permanent. To understand how I ended up lying in that hospital bed, listening to my own husband dismantle my life, you have to understand where I came from. You have to understand the woman who built the foundation I was standing on. My mother, Margaret Calloway, was an architectural conservator. She didn't build the flash, glass, and steel skyscrapers that redefine city skylines overnight, nor did she care for the modern disposable developments that are thrown up in a few months and crumble in a few decades. She loved history. She found old, undervalued historical brick buildings in mid-size markets, structures that people had forgotten, structures with bones so strong they had survived centuries of neglect. She bought them, restored them with painstaking historical accuracy, and leased them to tenants who appreciated that a building's character was an asset as real as its square footage. My mother was a woman of absolute precision. She used to sit at her massive drafting table late into the night, long after the office staff had gone home, cross-referencing old municipal deed registries and structural blueprints with the intensity of a scholar. She kept records the way traditional architects keep drawings, with the profound understanding that accuracy wasn't just dry, bureaucratic paperwork. Accuracy was protection, and that protection wasn't meant for herself. It was meant for the people who would come after her. It was meant for me. I remember sitting at her desk when I was just 16 years old. She was already deeply sick then, fighting a quiet, aggressive battle with the illness that would eventually take her from me, though she never let her posture slip. I was watching her flip through thick binders of legal asset clauses, her pale fingers tracing lines of dense, protective legal terminology. I remember sighing, complaining about how boring it all looked, how unnecessary it seemed when everyone around us seemed so friendly. She stopped, looked up from the papers, and fixed me with her clear, unwavering eyes. I can still see the reflection of the desk lamp in her glasses. She looked at me and said, "Maya, precision is how you love someone when you aren't there to hold their hand anymore. The world is full of people who are fluid with their intentions. Documents must be solid." At 16, I thought that was a cold way to look at life. I thought it was just the professional eccentricity of a woman who spent too much time dealing with old stone and rigid contracts. I didn't understand that she was looking far past her own horizon, trying to build a fortress around a daughter who was too trusting, too eager to believe that warmth was the same thing as safety. When she passed away, she left the historical preservation firm and its primary real estate assets inside a beautifully structured trust. It was designed to remain locked and protected under independent financial oversight until my 25th birthday, giving me time to grow, to get my degree, and to learn the business from the ground up without being crushed by the weight of the inheritance before I was ready. She had built a perfect structure. What she hadn't accounted for, what no blueprint can truly predict, was the human element that would eventually find a way inside. Julian entered my life when I was 27, 2 years after I had taken full control of my mother's firm. He was an absolute masterpiece of a man, charming, highly intelligent, and effortlessly fluent in the language of emotional support. I remember the night we met at a gallery opening in the city. He didn't approach me with a flashy pickup line. Instead, he stood beside me, looking at an architectural drawing, and asked a deeply insightful question about the preservation of historical masonry. He knew exactly what language to speak to open the doors to my world. Within 6 months, he felt like the missing piece of my existence. He was the partner who always remembered to check my calendar, the man who brought me lunch when I was buried under structural reports, and the voice that constantly reassured me when the pressure of running the firm felt too heavy to bear. He began to slowly, beautifully embed himself into the administrative and operational wings of the business. He never pushed. He invited himself in by being useful. He would say things like, "Let me handle the tenant dispute spreadsheets this week. Sweetheart, you look exhausted." Or, "I can sit down with the insurance adjusters so you don't have to waste your Saturday." It felt like luxury. It felt like love. But if you have ever ignored a nagging red flag in your life because it was wrapped in a warm embrace, if you've ever looked past an odd question because the person asking it was kissing your forehead, I want you to drop a comment right now. Why do we do that to ourselves? We want so badly to be seen, to be cherished, that we mistake a parasite's calculation for a partner's devotion. Because looking back, the questions were always shifting. Julian's curiosity about my life gradually evolved from, "How was your day?" into highly specific transactional inquiries about corporate governance. He would ask about the voting thresholds in our corporate charter over dinner, or gently inquire about who managed the physical title deeds to our historic properties when I was traveling out of state. He did it all with a smile, under the guise of protecting my legacy, making sure I wasn't being taken advantage of by outside contractors. He became my shadow, learning the layout of my mother's fortress from the inside, searching for the one weak stone that would allow him to bring the whole structure down. In the months leading up to the accident, the shift in our home became more palpable, though it remained buried under a mountain of polite insistence. Julian started focusing intensely on what he called streamlining my responsibilities. He would sit at the kitchen island, tracking my expressions while I reviewed the quarterly books and saturzols, and gently push a glass of wine into my hand. "You're carrying too much, Maya," he'd whisper, his voice a perfect imitation of a man desperate to protect his wife's peace. "If you split the operational governance, if you gave me temporary administrative oversight, the board wouldn't have to drag you into every minor dispute. It's about creating a buffer for you." I remember a specific dinner on my 28th birthday. We had invited my mother's lifelong legal advisor and closest friend, Evelyn. Throughout the entire evening, Julian was the perfect host, pouring wine, laughing at Evelyn's old stories, and asking insightful questions about the early days of the firm. But Evelyn had spent 40 years parsing the hidden motives behind legal contracts. She didn't just hear the words people said. She read the spaces between them. When Julian stepped into the kitchen to check on dessert, Evelyn grabbed my arm. Her grip was tight, her fingers cold. She pulled me deep into the shadows of the hallway coat room, lowered her voice to a sharp whisper, and looked straight into my eyes. "Maya," she said, "you need to be incredibly careful. A man who falls in love with your architecture will eventually try to rewrite your blueprints. He isn't looking at you. He's looking at the foundation." I remember laughing it off. I actually felt a flash of irritation at her, defending Julian with a wave of my hand, telling her she was just being paranoid from a lifetime of dealing with messy divorces and greedy heirs. I told her Julian loved me, that he was just trying to take the pressure off my shoulders so we could start a family. Now, lying completely motionless in the heavy silence of the intensive care unit, listening to the steady hiss-click of the mechanical ventilator keeping me alive, the memory of that warning tasted like ash in my mouth. Evelyn had seen the layout clearly from the very beginning. I had been completely blind, wrapped in the comfort of my own illusions, while my husband quietly measured the walls of my life, waiting for the perfect moment to structurally dismantle everything my mother had built to protect me. The door of the ICU room clicked once more as Hargrove pulled a heavy vinyl chair closer to the bed. I could hear the distinct rustle of legal-grade bond paper being extracted from a leather briefcase, a sound that, in my previous life, signaled the beginning of a routine corporate closing. Here, it sounded like a blade being drawn from a scabbard. Julian didn't sit down. He remained standing near the foot of my bed, his fingers casually tapping against the metal safety rail. That rhythmic, metallic tapping was completely devoid of anxiety. It was the idle gesture of a man waiting for an elevator. "I spoke with Dr. Vance before coming up," Hargrove said, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced courtroom murmur. He confirmed that the hospital's legal department hasn't raised any secondary objections to the temporary status declaration. Since there's no immediate family surviving on Maya's maternal side, your position as the primary spouse makes you the default statutory representative for all healthcare and operational emergencies. "And the administrative transition?" Julian asked. His voice was entirely empty of grief. Completely stripped of the desperate, tear-stained panic he had undoubtedly been performing for the nursing staff out at the front desk. "Did you verify the bank routing restrictions for the primary operational accounts?" "I did," Hargrove replied, the sound of a pen cap clicking off vibrating through the small space. The restructuring documents are fully drafted. We are leveraging the emergency management provisions within the state's corporate proxy statutes. Under normal circumstances, an asset transfer of this magnitude would require a full 90-day notice and a supermajority vote from the board of directors. But under the prolonged incapacitation clause, if the controlling partner is medically certified as unable to communicate for more than 21 consecutive days, administrative authority drops to the designated statutory proxy. That's you, Julian. So, what's missing? Julian's voice was sharp, cutting through the lawyer's procedural drone. One more signature, Hargrove said quietly. The chief of neurology needs to sign off on the official 21-day clinical status update tomorrow morning at exactly 9 a.m. The moment that document is timestamped and filed with the probate clerk, the permanent asset restructuring becomes legally irreversible. The old firm structure dissolves, and the holding company takes absolute title to the historical properties. There won't be a single piece of paper left that connects the core real estate to her mother's original trust. I lay beneath the thin hospital blanket, every muscle in my face locked into a terrifying, unnatural stillness while my mind raced through the implications of what I was hearing. They weren't sitting in this room trying to comfort a dying woman. They were standing over a corporate blueprint, tracing the lines of my physical destruction with the cold, analytical precision of land surveyors dividing an empty plot of dirt. Julian paused, and I heard the faint clink of his wedding band hitting the metal rail again. It's almost poetic, he murmured, his voice laced with a terrifying sense of self-satisfaction. She worked herself to the bone maintaining her mother's standards. She thought she was building an empire. In reality, she was just assembling the pieces for me. Hearing those words, something profound broke inside me, but it didn't leave me shattered. It left me cold. It left me clean. In that heavy, dark silence behind my eyelids, I experienced a complete psychological transformation. The grief, the crushing weight of the betrayal, the warmth I thought we shared. It all burned away, leaving nothing but absolute clarity. I realized in that exact second that Julian had never actually loved me. He had loved my utility. He loved what I could provide, the foundation I had inherited, the structural integrity of the asset portfolio my mother had left behind. I was never a wife to him. I was simply a highly efficient vehicle for his own ambition. If you have ever had to learn the absolute gut-wrenching difference between being loved for who you are versus being tolerated for what you provide, I want you to type the word boundaries in the comments right now. Because that realization is a lonely place to stand, but it is also the exact place where your real strength is born. You stop asking how they could do this to you, and you start asking how you're going to stop them. The panic that had been rattling around in my chest completely evaporated. I wasn't an oppressed, helpless victim anymore. I was a tenant in possession of my own mind, and I was about to quietly change the locks. Julian and Hargrove believed they were the only ones playing this game, but they had made the fatal mistake of assuming that an unmoving body meant a dead mind. "Let's get some air," Julian said, his footsteps finally moving away from the bed toward the door. "The scent of this room is starting to get to me. Call Vance and make sure the morning medical board is locked in. I want no delays at 9:00 a.m. "Consider it done," Hargrove replied. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind them, and the room returned to its steady, mechanical rhythm. I was alone again. The digital clock on the wall above my head hummed into the silence. I knew with absolute certainty that I had exactly 22 hours before that medical board signed my life away. I didn't have time to cry, and I didn't have time to break down. I needed a strategy, I needed an ally inside this building, and I needed to move before the sun came up. The afternoon dissolved into the cold, clinical shadows of the evening shift change. At exactly 4:30 p.m., the heavy door clicked open again, but the footsteps were different, light, rhythmic, carrying the quiet efficiency of someone whose life is measured in vitals and charts. It was Clara, the evening shift nurse. She moved around the bed with practiced ease, checking the IV lines and adjusting the digital flow meters. When she reached my right side to take my manual pulse, her warm, calloused fingers pressed firmly against my wrist. This was my only window. I gathered every ounce of neurological force I possessed, pushing through the heavy lethargy of my muscles, and applied a tiny, calculated, intentional counterpressure directly into her fingers. Clara froze. She didn't gasp. She didn't look toward the door or give any visible sign to the hallway outside that the reality of the room had just shifted. She maintained her flawless clinical composure, leaning slightly closer to the monitors as if reading a digital trend line, and lowered her voice to a breathy whisper. "Blink once if you can hear me, Maya." I opened my eyes and blinked exactly once. The sharp glare of the fluorescent lights stung my retinas, but the sight of Clara's calm, steady gaze was worth every ounce of physical pain. She immediately made a notation on her chart, her face completely unreadable to anyone passing by the glass window. "I've been watching your microfluctuations since Tuesday," she whispered, her hands remaining busy with my blankets to maintain the illusion of routine care. "Your husband has been pushing the medical board for an early incapacitation filing, asking questions that didn't sound like grief. I didn't trust his attorney's paperwork, so I've been keeping an independent time-stamped personal log of your neurological responses on my own device. It's formatted to full clinical standards. You are fully cooperative, Maya. We just need to make it official before 9:00 a.m. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was lined with broken glass after 3 weeks of mechanical intubation. No sound came out, just a dry, raspy breath. Clara understood before I could even display the frustration. She reached into her utility cart, pulled out a small sterile notepad and a pen, and placed them beneath the fold of the top sheet where my right hand could reach. "Don't waste your energy trying to talk," she murmured, positioning her body to block the line of sight from the hallway door. "Write down who needs to know you're awake. I'm on my break in 15 minutes, and I will use my personal phone to make the call." My fingers were stiff, shaking with a heavy weakness that made the pen feel like a lead pipe. But I forced my hand to move, dragging the ink across the clean white paper with absolute focus. I wrote a single name and a phone number that had been burned into my memory since childhood. Evelyn. Beneath it, I scrawled one more word in jagged, desperate letters. Tonight. Clara slipped the notepad into her scrub pocket, gave my hand one final, reassuring squeeze, and finished her chart entries with a professional flourish. "Keep your eyes closed for anyone else tonight," she whispered as she moved toward the exit. "Don't let them see a single shift in your breathing." She left, and the silence closed back around me. For the next 4 hours, I lay in the dark, measuring time by the slow drips of my IV line. Then, at exactly 8:45 p.m., the door opened with a different kind of quiet. I heard a familiar, sharp stride, the elegant, unhurried pace of a woman who had spent 40 years commanding respect in the city's highest courts. Evelyn had arrived. She had bypassed the main reception desk entirely, slipped through the staff entrance with Clara's help, and was now standing right beside my bed. "Hello, sweetheart," Evelyn whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the dark. She leaned down, and I felt her cool hand press against mine. I opened my eyes, looking into her fierce, intelligent gaze. She didn't cry or waste time with dramatic expressions of sympathy. Instead, she reached into her large leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, 14-page legal dossier, laying it directly on the edge of my blanket. "Clara told me everything," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a precise low murmur. "Julian has spent the last 3 weeks attempting an emergency administrative takeover of the preservation firm. He thinks he's being brilliant. He thinks because he has a temporary healthcare proxy, he can force a total structural restructuring through the probate court tomorrow morning at 9:00 a.m. She opened the folder, her fingers turning the pages with sharp efficiency. "I've spent the last 3 hours pulling every corporate filing he's touched since the accident. He's already frozen your loyal management staff out of the operational accounts, claiming he's protecting the business assets during a crisis. He thinks he's covered his tracks. But he doesn't realize who built this fortress." I looked at the documents, my mind locking onto the dense paragraphs of legal text. Even in my weakened state, the clarity of my mother's philosophy came flooding back to me. My mother had known something when she was sitting at her drafting table all those years ago, facing her own mortality while she altered her trust terms. She knew that the people most likely to try to take something from you aren't strangers jumping out of the dark. They are the people who eat dinner at your table, the people who claim to love you while they quietly measure your vulnerability. "We have exactly 12 hours before his medical board appointment," Evelyn said, looking at me with an unshakable confidence. "Maya, your mother didn't just leave you buildings. She left you in armor. And it's time to put it on." Evelyn leaned in closer, the ambient light from the street lamp outside casting long, architectural shadows across the hospital room ceiling. "Julian is an incredibly clever corporate operative, Maya, but he made the classic mistake of a fluid man. He assumed that standard templates apply to a custom-built life. He and Hargrove used the standard state statutory framework to execute this emergency asset transfer, entirely convinced that your incapacitation gave them an open side door." She flipped to page 9 of the dossier, her finger tapping a heavily underlined paragraph. "What they completely missed is a customized amendment deep within the original corporate charter. An amendment your mother added during a 3-hour phone call with me in the final week of her life. We called it the Dual Key Asset Clause." Maya forced her eyes to focus on the dense text. Her mother's meticulous handwriting was actually copied into the appendix. The clause was beautifully, clinically absolute. It dictated that any emergency operational transfer or restructuring exceeding 40% of the firm's total asset value could not be executed by a standard medical proxy alone. It legally required a secondary, independent physical verification of capacity from my mother's designated perpetual legal counsel, which was Evelyn's firm. Julian and Hargrove had completely bypassed it, either out of sheer arrogance or because they didn't think a 40-year-old trust document had teeth. By attempting to push this through without my verification, they haven't just committed a procedural error, Evelyn whispered, a cold, elegant smile touching her lips. They have crossed the line into actionable corporate fraud. But we aren't going to warn them. We are going to let them walk right up to the edge. By 4 a.m., while Julian was undoubtedly asleep in our pristine mid-century home, believing he was only 5 hours away from an empire, the hospital room became a quiet command center. Clara brought in the hospital's attending chief physician, Dr. Okafor, who had been quietly tracking Julian's aggressive maneuvers with her own professional reservations. In their presence, I took the pen, With a hand that was shaking but completely unyielding, I signed a formal affidavit of full cognitive awareness, time-stamped and witnessed by Dr. Okafor and Evelyn. By 5:30 a.m., Evelyn's team had electronically filed the affidavit, along with Clara's time-stamped clinical notes directly with the probate clerk, instantly and automatically dissolving Julian's emergency medical proxy. The trap was fully set, the foundation was restored, and all we had to do now was wait for the clock to strike 9. At exactly 9:04 a.m., the heavy wooden door of the ICU room swung open. Julian strode in first, carrying himself with that effortless, predatory grace I had mistaken for confidence for 6 long years. Hargrove followed a step behind him, a sleek leather folder tucked neatly under his arm like a trophy. They didn't look at the monitors. They didn't look at my chart. They walked in expecting to find a silent, compliant room, a vacant piece of property ready to be claimed. But they stopped dead in their tracks 3 feet from the threshold. I was sitting completely upright, my pillows adjusted behind me. I was holding a small glass of ice water in my right hand, taking a slow, deliberate sip. To my left stood Evelyn, her arms folded across her chest, her expression as unreadable as granite. To my right stood Dr. Okafor, holding a freshly printed, time-stamped medical capacity assessment. Julian's eyes traveled from Evelyn to the doctor and finally landed on me. The sophisticated, flawless facade he had spent years maintaining didn't shatter all at once. It dissolved in stages, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. "Good morning, Julian," I said. My voice was still thick, raspy, and raw from weeks of mechanical intubation, but it arrived in the room with the absolute crushing weight of a foundation settling back into place. "I've been listening to you since Thursday morning. I heard every single word." Hargrove was the first to react. His eyes darted to the leather folder under his arm, his legal instincts instantly identifying a catastrophic shift in the room's layout. "Julian," he whispered, stepping back toward the door, "we need to step outside right now." "There is nowhere to step, Hargrove," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into the quiet space like a heavy steel gate. At 5:30 this morning, a formal affidavit of Maya's full cognitive awareness was filed and time-stamped with the probate court. Julian's emergency medical proxy is legally dead. Furthermore, we've filed an immediate cease and desist orders alongside a petition for an absolute asset freeze on every holding account you attempted to manipulate over the last 21 days. Julian took a step toward the bed, his hands coming up in a desperate, frantic attempt to rebuild his mirage. "Maya, sweetheart, you don't understand," he stammered, his voice climbing an octave as the calculation failed him. "I was only doing what I thought was necessary to protect the firm while you were incapacitated. The board was in chaos. I was trying to save your legacy." "You weren't saving a legacy, Julian," I said, setting the glass of water down on the metal bedside table with a sharp, echoing click. "You were surveying the walls, waiting for them to fall so you could claim the dirt. But my mother built this house, and she made sure the foundation belongs exclusively to me." Julian stood entirely frozen for a fraction of a second, his mind desperately turning over the legal and financial layout, trying to find a corner he could slip through. But there were no corners left. Hargrove had already turned his back, stepping completely out into the busy hospital corridor to save his own license. Julian looked back at me once more, his mouth opening to speak, but the words died in his throat. He saw the complete absence of anger in my eyes. He saw only a cold architectural clarity. He turned around and walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy, dragging, completely stripped of that smooth confidence he had worn like a tailored suit. The aftermath moved with the deliberate, unyielding thoroughness of a system designed to protect. Julian was permanently stripped of any association with the historic preservation firm. With Evelyn's meticulous oversight, we filed a massive civil suit for corporate fraud and asset manipulation. As the legal investigation dug into his accounts, his fair-weather business associates and the board members he had tried to manipulate quickly abandoned him, leaving him entirely isolated. He was forced to pay back every single dollar he had frozen out of our operating accounts. By the time the final legal settlement was signed, he was living alone in a cramped, ordinary apartment on the edge of the city, completely separated from the architecture he had tried so hard to steal. I left the hospital 12 days later. Clara walked me all the way to the glass exit doors, her arm supporting mine as my feet touched the warm, sunlit pavement. I looked back at the towering brick facade of the hospital, taking a slow, deep breath of the fresh afternoon air. "You're going to build something incredible out of this, Maya," Clara said quietly, a genuine smile softening her clinical composure. "I'm not building anything new, Clara," I replied, squeezing her hand with all the strength I had regained. "I'm just protecting what's already there. My mother taught me how." 6 months after the accident, I was sitting back at my mother's massive drafting table in the corner office of the firm. The quarterly books were completely clean, the historic properties were performing beautifully, and the loyal staff who had been frozen out were back where they belonged. That Saturday, Evelyn came over to my apartment for dinner. I had cooked a traditional, slow-braised recipe exactly the way my mother used to make it, focusing on the patience of the process rather than the speed of the result. We sat at the kitchen table, the city lights blinking softly through the glass window, and we talked about things that had absolutely nothing to do with Julian, the court filings, or the hospital board. We talked about my mother. "She would have found his planning completely predictable, you know," Evelyn said, taking a slow sip of her wine. "She spent 3 hours on the phone with me that final week specifically because she knew how fluid the world can be when you aren't around to anchor it. She added that stage 3 verification clause because she wanted to make sure you had a wall that would hold, even if the person sleeping next to you turned out to be a stranger." I looked down at the old architectural blueprints, tracing the edge of the kitchen counter. I thought about my mother in those final weeks, managing her entire company from a clinical bed while her body made its way toward an end. She was precise enough to be completely honest about the dark layout of human intentions. She built a fortress for a 14-year-old daughter who didn't even know why it would matter until 3 decades later. Precision, it turns out, isn't cold bureaucracy. Precision is one of the most durable, unshakable forms of love the world has ever seen.